Shabbat Shalom, everybody. It is wonderful to be here with you in person, and Shabbat Shalom to everybody who's joining us wherever you may be. At this time, we continue with our blessing for the candle lighting as we bring in the warmth of Shabbat. I invite you to please rise if you are able to pay and turn to page 26 for the Hatikadush. Amen.
ובחיי לכל בית ישראל, בגלה, ובזמן לקריב, ויאמרו אמן. יש מרבה מבורך, לעולם לא מעלמיה, יתברך וישתבח, ויתפאר ויתרומם ויתנשא, ויתהדר ויתעלה ויתעלה, שמי דקודשה בריחו לעילה, מן כל ברכתה ושירתה, תושבחתה ונחמתה, דמירון בעלמה, ויאמרו אמן. ברכו את אדוני המבורך, ברוך אדוני המבורך, לעולם ועד.
We read together at the top of page 33. As you taught Torah to those whose names I bear, teach me Torah too. Its mystery beckons, yet I struggle with its truth. You meant Torah for me. Did you mean the struggle for me too? Don't let me struggle alone. Help me to understand, to be wise, to listen, to know. Lead me into the mystery. Baruch Ata Adonai, Ohev Amo Israel.
Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad, Baruch Shem Kivod Malchuto, Le'olam Eloheinu.
Hear, O Israel, Adonai is our God, Adonai is one. Blessed is God's glorious majesty forever and ever. You may be seated. Please join us for the Ve'ahavta.
ואהבת את אדוני אלוהיך בכל לבבך ובכל נפשך ובכל מאודך, והיו הדברים האלה אשר אנוכי מצווך היום על לבביך, ושיננתם לבניך ודיברת בם בשבתך בביתך ובלכתך בדרך ובשוכבך ובקומך, וקשרתם לאות על ידך, והיו לטוטפות בין עיניך, וכתבתם על מזוזות ביתך ובשעריך, למען תזכרו ועשיתם את כל מצוותיי, והייתם קדושים לאלוהיכם. אני אדוני אלוהיכם, אשר הוצאתי אתכם מארץ מצרים, להיות לכם לאלוהים. אני אדוני אלוהיכם.
Standing on the parted shores of history, we still believe what we were taught before ever we stood at Sinai's foot, that wherever we go, it is eternally Egypt. And there is a better place, a promised land, that the winding way to that promise passes through the wilderness, that there is no way to get from here to there except by joining hands, marching together.
מי כמוך באלים אדוני, מי כמוך נהדר וקודש. נורא תהילות אוסף אלה, נורא תהילות אוסף אלה. מלכותך ראו בניך, בוקעי הים לפני משה.
We continue on page 43. Let there be love and understanding among us. Let peace and friendship be our shelter from life's storms. Adonai, help us to walk with good companions, to live with hope in our hearts and eternity in our thoughts, that we may lie down in peace and rise up waiting to do your will. Baruch ata Adonai, הפורס סוכת שלום עלינו ועל כל עמו ישראל ועל ירושלים. We continue with the Amidah on page 46, and I invite you to please rise if you are able.
Adonai, שפתי תפתחו ופי יגיד תהילתך. Adonai, open up my lips that my mouth may declare your praise. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu ve'Elohei avotenu ve'imotenu, Elohei Avraham, Elohei Yitzchak, ve'Elohei Yaakov, Elohei Sarah, Elohei Rivka, Elohei Rachel, ve'Elohei Leah, Ha'el Hagadol Hagibor v'Hanora, El Elyon, Gomel Chasadim Tovim, וקונה הכל, וזוכר חסדי אבות ואימהות, ומביא גאולה לבני בניהם, למען שמו באהבה. מלך עוזר ומושיע ומגן. ברוך אתה אדוני, מגן אברהם ועזרת שרה. אתה גיבור לעולם אדוני, מחיה הכל אתה, רב להושיע. משיב הרוח ומוריד הגשם. מכלכל חיים בחסד, מחיה הכל ברחמים רבים. סומך נופלים ורופא חולים, ומתיר אסורים, ומקיים אמונתו לשני עפר. מי כמוך בעל גבורות ומדומה לך, מלך ממית ומחיה ומצמיח ישועה, ונאמן אתה להחיות הכל. ברוך אתה אדוני, מחיה הכל.
Days pass and the years vanish, and we walk sightless among miracles. God, fill our eyes with seeing and our minds with knowing, that there be moments when your presence, like lightning, illuminates the darkness in which we walk. Help us to see wherever we gaze that the bush burns unconsumed, and we, clay touched by God, will reach out for holiness and exclaim in wonder, how filled with awe is this place, and we did not know it. Blessed is the Eternal One, the Holy God. Baruch atah Adonai, ha'el hakadosh. You may be seated. We continue at the top of page 61 together. Grant us peace, your most precious gift, O eternal source of peace, and give us the will to proclaim its message to all the peoples of the earth. Bless our country as a safeguard of peace, its advocate among the nations. May contentment reign within our borders, health and happiness within our homes. Strengthen the bonds of friendship and fellowship among all the inhabitants of every land. Plant virtue in every soul, and may the love of your name hallow every home and every heart. Praised are you, Eternal One, who blesses our people with peace. Baruch atah Adonai, hamevarech et amo Israel bashalom.
Shalom Rav al Yisrael amcha tasim leolam. Shalom Rav al Yisrael amcha tasim leolam. Ki atah melech adon lechol hashalom. Ki atah melech adon lechol hashalom. Shalom Rav al Yisrael amcha tasim leolam. Shalom Rav al Yisrael amcha tasim leolam. וטוב בעיניך לפאר את עמך ישראל, בכל עת ובכל שעה בשלומך. שלום רב על ישראל עמך תשים לעולם. שלום רב על ישראל עמך תשים לעולם. תשים לעולם. תשים לעולם.
We pray silently.
Good evening, Shabbat Shalom. So nice to see everybody, both here and to be seen by those of you who are live streaming. We're so glad that we are all together, either in person or remotely. We are going to continue now with our Torah service, which begins in our prayer books on page 244. There is none like you among the gods, Adonai. There are no deeds like yours. You are sovereign over all worlds. Your dominion is in all generations. Adonai reigns. Adonai has reigned. Adonai will reign forever and ever. Adonai will give strength to our people. Adonai will bless our people with peace. Will you please rise?
אין כמוך באלוהים אדוני, ואין כמעשיך. מלכותך מלכות כל עולמים, וממשלתך בכל דור ודור. אדוני מלך, אדוני מלך, אדוני ימלוך לעולם ועד. אדוני עוז יבוא ייתן, אדוני יברך את עמו בשלום. עברה רחמים, היטיבה ברצונך את ציון. תבנה חמות ירושלים, תבנה חמות ירושלים. עירך לבד פתחנו, מלך אלרם ונישא, אדון עולמים.
In this scroll is the secret of our people's life from Sinai until now. Its teaching is love and justice, goodness and hope. Freedom is its gift to all who treasure it.
כי מציון תצא תורה, כי מציון תצא תורה, ודבר אדוני מירושלים. ברוך שנתן תורה תורה, ברוך שנתן תורה תורה, לעמו ישראל בקדושתו. שמע ישראל, אדוני אלוהינו, אדוני אחד, אחד אלוהינו, גדול אדוננו, קדוש שמו. גדול אדוני איתי, ונרוממה שמו יחדיו. לך אדוני הגדולה, הגבורה, התפארת והנצח והוד. כי חול בשמיים ובארץ, כי חול בשמיים ובארץ. לך אדוני הממלכה, המתנשא לכל רוב.
You may be seated. Well, I want to suggest to you that among the many patterns that can be discerned in this vast biblical literature of ours, one especially calls out to us from this week's Torah portion, Parshat Shmini, from chapters 9, 10, and 11 of the book of Leviticus. And this pattern goes something like this. So often in the Bible, when an episode or a series of episodes has arrived at a grand climax, a moment of contentment, a moment of completion, a moment of felicity, a moment of peace, immediately following that wonderful climax falls apart. And it falls apart because of human willfulness and human malevolence and human error and waywardness. And we see this over and over again in the Bible. Let me give you some examples. In the Garden of Eden, God promises to the first man and the first woman a life of ease, where all they need to do is pick the fruit off the tree and live potentially forever. The Bible's initial conditions make possible the eternality of the individual and of the community. All they have to do is reach for the tree of life and eat it, and they live forever. With one proviso, God says to them, for only one thing. Think of a line drawn down the middle of a piece of paper, and on the right hand is all the wonderful things that you can get. Make a list of them. On the left are the privations, what you can't do, and there's only one item. Just don't eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And what do? They ate of it. And so they undermine the possibility of eternal bliss and felicity. Think of the story of Jacob and Esau. Isaac has gone north to get a wife for himself. Abraham Sr.'s servant has done this, and found one of the great heroes of the Bible, found Rebekah. I've often thought that if I were the one to have written the first prayer of the Amidah, Avot V'Imahot, I might not have said God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That's before we added the matriarchs. I might have said the God of Abraham, Rebekah, and Jacob. Rebekah looms extremely large in biblical literature. And Abraham Sr.'s servant finds Rebekah for Isaac. And she comes down and joins herself with Isaac's family. And on the way down, by the way, two brothers, Isaac and Ishmael, who had been alienated early in their own lives, come together to bury, together as one, their father Abraham. And Rebekah and Isaac are getting ready to start a family, but Rebekah is barren. And God opens the womb of Rebekah so that the next generation can be called forth. And what happens? She's pregnant, and immediately those two boys in her womb are fighting and struggling together. And the family is riven with contention to such a degree that Jacob has to flee north from his brother, leaving bereaved parents behind. Jacob works for 20 years for his wives, and finally is allowed to come back down, and he settles in the land of Canaan, Vayeshev Yaakov. And immediately, Jacob's sons are fighting with one another, with jealousy and with rage and alienation, in which the family's narrative spins out of control for almost 13 chapters. The Israelites are freed from Egypt. Finally, they cross the Sea of Reeds, and they sing this wonderful song, Micha Mocha Be'elim Adonai, who is like you, O Lord, among the mighty. That's a generation that has seen more miracles than any generation in the history of humankind. And what do? No sooner than the mud has been caked off from their feet from walking amidst the sea that is split, they complain. Where's the manna? Where's the quails? And this complaining becomes congenital until later on in the biblical narrative, the people say, would that we could go back to Egypt, where we had milk and honey. Do you see this pattern? Some high moment in the biblical narrative is, as it were, torn apart by human proclivity to fight with one another and to do things that undermine the possibility of community. In our Torah portion, Shmini, we have, beginning with chapter 9, the completion of the building of the tabernacle and the preparation after 7 days of the ordination of Aaron and his sons, the very first sacrifice on the altar. Now, this preparation has gone on for chapter after chapter after chapter. And this is one of the grand climaxes of biblical literature. After all, the priestly covenant, which focuses on sacrifice, goes something like this. We should offer sacrifices to God, and God promises to receive those sacrifices. There's a prophetic sacrifice, there's a covenant, there's a patriarchal covenant. There are a variety of covenants in the Bible. This is the priestly covenant, a worship that is going to be accepted by God. And no sooner does God receive the sacrifice than the Torah says that Aaron's sons, Nadav and Abihu, bring a strange fire before God, a fire that was not commanded of them. And that while earlier in the portion, God consumed the sacrifice, the next verse after Nadav and Abihu bring this strange fire uses the same Hebrew word, vatochal, to consume, to eat the sacrifice. It's now applied to Nadav and Abihu. And a fire comes out and consumes them. What do we have here? What does this pattern, this pervasive and very disturbing pattern, what does it mean? Is this the way things are? Is this the way things always will be? Whenever we arrive at a moment of accomplishment, of achievement, of coherence, of peace, we are going to undermine it. And it looks here like the Bible's overall worldview is one of pessimism. We may be hopeful for a while, but it will be undone. What kind of responses does the Bible give to this question? Optimism or pessimism? Well, there is the option of utopia. After all, the Garden of Eden, even though Adam and Eve are expelled from it, still exists in biblical literature. And what we might see in the narrative of the Bible is the search for a return to Eden, a pre-lapsarian reality before the fall. Or perhaps looking ahead to later biblical literature, we might look to the prophet Jeremiah, who talks about a new heaven and a new earth. Who Jeremiah, in another passage, talks about no longer will the covenant be a contingent matter because I, God, will place the covenant on their hearts, and they will therefore, the people will therefore automatically do the right thing. This is utopian thinking. That really what we can have is something like an age of innocence, or to expand it a bit, a politics of innocence, a society grounded on the lovely innocence of human beings. I want to read to you an excerpt from a book that I have been reading by a great modern British philosopher, Bernard Williams. And here's what he says. At one level, we must recognize that there is no politics of innocence. And therefore we might feel a certain pessimism. At a more interesting level, Williams goes on to say, it is only after the truth has been recognized that there is no return to innocence, that the alternatives of optimism and pessimism really come into question. In this perspective, the difference between thinking that there can be a return to innocence and that there cannot be that alternative, yes, we can return to innocence, no, we cannot, is not a difference between optimism and pessimism, but rather between fantasy and reality. The return to Eden, the hope to return to an innocence, is fantasy. And I want to say to you that the Bible is interested in everything but fantasy. It's not creating a Shangri-La for us. It is dealing with the deep realities of the human condition. And Williams goes on to say that if we start from that point, optimism and pessimism will be seen as attitudes to the life that human beings can live within the borders of reality. Borders already set by the imperfection, the suffering, and the confusion that are necessarily involved in any large-scale human enterprise. The question of pessimism, or its reverse, will then be, and here William says something quite remarkable, I think. Let me start the sentence again. The question of pessimism or its reverse will then be, granted that these are life's realities, is it worthwhile? That's the question. I want to suggest to you that the Bible's view is steadfastly, even heroically, optimistic. Even though it struggles with human imperfection, the way in which we tend to undermine the projects that we begin, that we undertake, that the Bible insists on optimism. And that optimism can be characterized by our millennial desire and insistence on rebuilding. When society begins to fall apart, when we see the deep crevices in the human condition, we insist on rebuilding. And in this sense, all the pain and travail that communities and that individuals experience, we are committed to the claim that life is worthwhile, and then we can help to reconstruct a worthwhile social reality. Now, I'm going to take my evidence for this from one of the strangest, least promising passages in the entire Bible. This week's Torah portion and next week's Torah portion. You may remember next week's Torah portion is Tazria Matzorah, which whenever the calendar points to one of us clergy, that, for example, it's my turn to give the Devar Torah on Tazria Matzorah, I begin to perspire. Because this is a daunting Torah portion. And so, from chapters 11, 12, 13, and 14 of Leviticus, I am going to show you in this most unpromising material the biblical author's insistence on rebuilding out of the debacle. I'm going to tell you what the topics are. Now, we have to recognize a distinction in these chapters of Leviticus between the topics and their realization in detail. If I, for once in many, many months and years, reach for a baseball analogy, in the history of early baseball, in the 10s and 20s and 30s, even the 40s, when the inning was over, what did the outfielders do with their gloves? They threw them on the grass. Would we think of doing that today? Mickey Mantle essentially ruined his career by tripping over something left on the field. In other words, the game of baseball is still played, but we look askance at the details of the way it may have been played a long time ago. Automobiles are part of the landscape of our society, but nobody would think of, maybe I need to get out of my car and go to the front and crank the crank so that it will start. The topics remain the same. The details change over time. The details in these chapters of Leviticus are the most foreign possible to our sensibilities. Let us not be caught up in those details, which always are changing, and ask ourselves, what are the main topics? And I'm going to list them for you. Childbirth, food, the integrity of our homes, the integrity of our bodies, medicine, a way to recover from illness, the restoration of individuals who may have betrayed their community, the possibility of restoration back into the community. What Leviticus tells us is that these are the elements through which we can always continue to reconstruct our broken societies. The concern about proper nourishment, about the ways of childbirth, its vulnerabilities and its possibilities. The integrity of our homes, the health of our bodies, the recovery from illness, giving us a methodology, and most especially, those individuals who suffer alienation from the community, there is a way back. The community is stronger when it's the most inclusive. And the challenge of inclusivity is the challenge of welcoming back those who have gone astray and may have in some way betrayed us. Yes, there is backsliding, but backsliding is not the end. There is always the possibility of rebuilding. And here I want to cite, without quoting, one of the later verses of Psalm 130. Where there is night, we know there is going to be morning again. The morning always looms, whether for the community or for the individual. This is the Bible's fundamental message, or we might put it another way. At what point does the saga of the often beleaguered, threatened, vulnerable Jewish community, when does that saga end? When do we finally succumb to the slings and arrows of the outrageous fortune that beset us? The Bible's answer is never. And that's our answer too, isn't it? That there is no calamity, however heinous, however troublesome, however tragic. We're committed to this, aren't we? That will ever vanquish us once and for all. The Bible's literature ends on a circle, so that there is never an end to the return to the foundations of our community. I want to finally read a verse from one of the greatest of all poems, and that is Psalm 73. I encourage you when you get home to open your Bibles and look at Psalm 73. God is truly good to Israel, to those whose heart is pure. As for me, the psalmist said, my feet had almost strayed. My steps were nearly led off course, for I envied the wanton. I saw the wicked at ease. Some problem in the economy of divine design has revealed itself. And this psalmist, this poet, in his or her great honesty says, I'm about to leave off from the paradigm that God is good. God does not seem to be good. But this psalmist struggles for more light and understanding and says, look, it was for nothing that I kept my heart pure and washed my hands in innocence, seeing that I have been constantly afflicted, that each morning brings new punishments. It was in vain that I kept my heart pure. Had I decided, the psalmist says, to say these things out loud, I should have been false to the circle of your disciples. Had I said what was on my mind, which was tending toward pessimism, I would have not discharged my duty to my community. And even though my faith is under duress, the community must survive, and I have an obligation to the community. And so the psalmist says, so I applied myself to understand this afresh. Here is, I think, a wonderful and poignant example of an individual who has seen reverses and whose faith has been shattered, but nevertheless insists on finding a way to rebuild. Out of a very unpromising Torah portion comes something remarkable about the lineaments, the rudiments, the elements of a society under duress that nevertheless insists on rebuilding and going on. I'm going to read to you a couple of verses from the end of Leviticus chapter 9, and then the first verses from chapter 10. Without rising, let's say the blessing for the reading of Torah together. Baruch hu et Adonai hamvorach, Baruch Adonai hamvorach leolam va'ed, Baruch Adonai hamvorach leolam va'ed, Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher bachar banu mikol ha'amim, natan lanu et Torato, Baruch atah Adonai, noten haTorah. Noten haTorah is to be translated not who gave the Torah, but who gives the Torah. When is the Torah being given? All the time. Think of the analogy of the radio. Is there music in this room? Yes. We just don't have a receiver to turn it on. Music is always streaming in here. Torah is always being given. Let's turn on, that prayer suggests, our receptors. Vayisa Aharon et Yadav El Ha'am Vayevarchem Vayered Me Asot Hachatat V'Ha'olah V'Hashlamim V'Yavo Moshe v'Aharon El Ohel Moed V'Yetzu V'Yivrechu et Ha'am V'Yera Kvod Adonai El Kol Ha'am V'Teitzei Eish Milfanai Adonai V'tochal al hamizbeach et ha'olah ve'et ha'chalavim. Vayar kol ha'am v'yaronu v'yiplu al panehem. Without interruption now, without any space, so often different chapters are separated by spaces, so it becomes easy to find them. There's no space here. When I was in here the other day to try to find these verses, I had trouble doing it because one thing follows another. It's as if the rabbis are trying to hide this episode. Vayikach b'nei Aharon Nadav Avihu, ish machtachto, v'yitnu bahem eish, v'yasimu aleha ketoret, v'yakrivu lifnei Adonai, eish zara, asher lo tziva otam, v'teitzei eish milfanei Adonai, v'tochal otam, v'yamutu lifnei Adonai. V'yomer Moshe al Aharon, Hu asher diber Adonai lemor, bikrovaya kadesh v'apanei kol ha'am ekabed, v'yidom Aharon. Very dramatic moment, which I'm now going to try to translate. Aaron, at the end of this moment of ordination, lifted up his hands toward the people and he blessed them. And he stepped down after having engaged in the sin offering and the burnt offering and the peace offering. And at that point, Moses and Aaron entered the tent of meeting, and when they came out, they blessed the people. And at that moment, the kavod, the presence of God, appeared to all the people. And a fire went out from God, and God consumed from the altar the burnt offering and the offerings of the fat pieces. And all the people saw what had happened, and they rejoiced and fell on their faces. And the sons of Aaron, Nadav and Abihu, each took his own fire pan and placed in it burning coals, and on that they placed incense. And they sacrificed before the Lord an eshzarah, a strange fire, about which they had not been commanded. And a fire went out from before the Lord. The tochal otam, not consumed the sacrifice, consumed them. And they died before the Lord. And Moses said to Aaron, now we see what God meant when God said that I will be sanctified by those who are privileged to come near to me. Bikrovai ekadesh. And I will be honored by all the people. And I will be honored by all the people. Vayidom Aharon. And Aaron was silent. Aaron got the point that there is responsibility here when you are given the privilege of being involved in a sacred community, and especially as its leaders. The blessing after the reading of Torah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher natan lanu Torah emet v'chayei olam nata b'tochenu. Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah. Amen. At this point, let us take into our hearts those members of our community, our circle of friends, those who are ailing of body, of mind, and of spirit, so that we can think about them and raise prayers for their return to health. I'm going to mention the names on the list that I have, and then I'm going to give you an opportunity to mention the names of those about whom you are thinking. We think especially of Nancy Friedman, Amelia Hegarty, Maddie Jefferson, Byron Krantz, Dr. Anna Majerovich, Richard Moore, and Bob Shippey. Please mention either to yourselves or out loud those about whom you are thinking. Let's join together in the singing of the Mishaberach. You can find the words on page 253.
May the source of strength, who blessed the ones before us, help us find the courage to make our lives a blessing, and let us say, Amen. Mishiberach imotenu, mekor habracha le'avotenu. Bless those in need of healing with refuah shelema, the renewal of body, the renewal of spirit, and let us say, Amen.
And now, in order to express our gratitude for the presence of Torah in our midst, let us please rise.
וזאת התורה אשר שם משה לפני בני ישראל. אני אדוני ביד משה. ללי 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 ללי
Now, we turn in our prayer books to page 256 while we remain standing. Yahalelu et Shem Adonai ki niskav shemo levado. Let us praise the name of Adonai, for God's name alone is exalted. It is a tree of life for those who hold fast to it, and all its supporters are happy. Its ways are ways of pleasantness, and all its paths are peace. Return us to you, Adonai, and we will return. Renew our days as of old.
עץ חיים היא למחזיקים בה, ותרומכיה מאושר. דרכיה דרכי נוח, וכל נתיבותיך שלום.
We turn now in our prayer books to page 282. We remain standing for the Aleinu.
עלינו לשבח לחדון הכל, לתת גדולה ליוצר בראשית, שלא עשנו כגויי הארצות, ולא שמנו כמשפחות האדמה, שלא שם חלקנו כהם, וגורלנו ככל המונם, ואנחנו קוראים ומשתחווים ומודים לפני מלך מלכי המלכים, הקדוש ברוך הוא. ונאמר, והיה אדוני למלך על כל הארץ, ביום ההוא תהיה אדוני אחד, ושמו אחד.
You may be seated. And we continue on page 289 as we prepare for the recitation of the Mourner's Kaddish. The light of life is a finite flame. Like the Shabbat candles, life is kindled, it burns, it glows, it is radiant with warmth and beauty. But soon it fades, its substance is consumed, and it is no more. In light we see, in light we are seen. Flames dance, and our life burns down in gutters. There's an end to the flames. We see no more and are no more seen. Yet we do not despair, for we are more than a memory slowly fading into the darkness. With our lives we give life. Something of us can never die. We move in the eternal cycle of darkness and death, of light and of life. We think now of our loved ones whom death has recently taken from us, those who died at this season in years past, and those whom we have drawn into our hearts with our own. We think especially on this occasion of members of our congregational community whom we lost during this past week: Albert Gordon, Judith Jacobson, Joel Schaefer, Pamela Susan Schultz. And we also think of those who have been laid to rest during the past 30 days. Jack Harold Davidson, Karen Feinberg, Marjorie Lyon Groden, Terry Levy, Miriam Mimi Arnstein, Louis Reutblatt, Gladys R. Strauss, Betty Abramovitz, Tiffany Bosson, Ryan Gallagher, Carmela Schneider, Megan Thompson. And we also take into our hearts those individuals whose yahrzeits occur at this time. Jesse Alsbacher, Myrtle R. Altschul, A.B. Amster, Shia M. Arsham, Charles E. Asherman, Abe H. Berg, Herman Bernheimer, Abraham C. Bigelson, Claire Lader Buchhalter, Roberta Friedman Borkat, Sanford Brody, Dr. Lewis H. Brooks, Ruth Becker Kahn, David J. Cohn, Bertie Stoddard Cole, Edwin R. Cole, Lily A. Copenhagen, Fanny Mayer Dreyfus, Harold Fellinger, Herman H. Felsman, Eugene Freed, Janet Cole Friedman, Molly Friedman, Dr. Morris E. Gans, Joel C. Gellen, Manuel Gertie, Stanley I. Goldberg, Florence Goldstein, Harry P. Gross, Nathan Gurin, Jerry Hartman, Cassidy Stark Impink, Dr. Nathan B. Jaffe, Irving Kane, Dr. Emmanuel Klaus, Jacob A. Klein, Matilda B. Clivens, Harold R. Krause, Annie Levin, Lucille R. Levin, Rebecca Wolf Luntz, Martha B. Markowitz, Merle W. Marks, Marvin Oppenheim, Dorothy K. Orkin, Mildred Levy-Pickus, Jack Pearson, Herman J. Rich, Constance Zucker Ryder, Dr. Harry J. Reamer, Marvin Ritzenberg, George Rothstein, Caroline Schartenberg, Irving R. Schumann, Jack H. Schwartz, Esther Seidman, Ida Senor, Marvin Seamus, Irving M. Silver, Virginia Horkheimer Silver, Lawrence E. Simon, Wilbur A. Stoyer, Charles Tillis, Aaron E. Tratner, Sylvester L. Traub, Grace G. Warren, Jerome A. Weinberger, Samuel D. Wise, Francis Selman Zake. If there's anyone at this point who would like to make mention of a loved one or a friend whose name has not just now been read, please take this opportunity to do so. And now I would like to invite those who are observing the Shiva period, the first 7 days after the death of a loved one, if you wish, will you please rise? Those who are observing the Shloshim period, the first 30 days after the death of a loved one, if you wish, will you please rise? And those who are observing the Yartzeit, the anniversary of the death of a loved one, please rise. And now as a caring congregation, we rise together as one. We sanctify the name of the word of our God with the mourner's Kaddish. As we say together on page 294, Yitgadal v'yitkadash shemei rabbah, v'alma divrach hirutei v'yamlich malchutei, v'chayichon of yomeichon v'chayedechol beit Yisrael, v'agalav izman kari v'yamru amen. Yehei shemei rabbah mevarach le'olam olamei elmaya, Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh, v'yitadar v'yitaleh v'yitalal shmei dekudashah barichu, la'ela min kol birchata v'shirata, tushbachata v'nechemata da'amiran bi'alma v'yamru amen. Yehei shalom rabba min shemaya v'chayim, aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'yamru amen. Oseh shalom bimromav, hu ya'aseh shalom, aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'yamru amen. May the source of peace send peace to all who mourn and comfort all the bereaved among us, and let us say together, amen.
Amen.
You may be seated. Always at this point in our service, after we remember our beloved deceased, we also think about life, the opportunities that life provides for us, and the simchas, the wonderful joys that we are able to celebrate. If you are celebrating, observing a simcha, something wonderful that has happened in your life or the life of your family, if you feel like sharing it with us, we'd love to know. So I'm going to assume that everybody, maybe it's too glib to say it, but I'm going to say it anyway, that we have things to celebrate and things to be grateful for. And one of them is to be able to have come back together again, to be together as a community. And we hope that those present, that our community grows, although we recognize that many of us find it important, convenient to be able to stay at home, and we're delighted to have you if this is the best way for you to access our service together. But we do miss you and hope that you will come back together with us. Let's conclude our service with the singing, first Shechianu. We're going to conclude our service with the singing of Adon Olam. You can find the words on page 321. Let's join in together.
Adon Olam, asher malach, b'terem kol yitzir nivra, li'ed nasa, v'chatzoko, azay melech shmo nikra, v'yacharei kichlot hakol, levado yimloch nora. והוא יהיה בתפארה, והוא אחד
We read that wine gladdens the human heart. So let's join together in the Kiddush.
ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם בורא פרי ובאפל ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם אשר קידשנו במצוותיו ורצוונו בשבת קודשו באהבה וברצון הנחילנו זיכרון למעשה בראשית כי הוא יום תחילה
And now a blessing over our bounty.
ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם המוציא לחם מן הארץ. אמן.
Adonai oz le'amo yitain, Adonai yivarech et amo v'shalom. May the Lord give strength unto God's people. May the Lord bless God's people, all of God's peoples, with the blessings of shalom, of peace. Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom.